who can take them seriously?
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to starve to death. There are caterers there.
That's right. That's a valid point.
You know what I mean?
In November 1972, dozens of TV stations across the country refused to air the same episode of the same sitcom, all on the same night. Thousands of protest letters flooded CBS. The press argued about it constantly, and yet roughly 65 million Americans still sat down and watched it anyway. What had the whole nation in an uproar wasn't a war film or a presidential address. It was a fictional character named Maude, played by Bea Arthur, choosing to have an abortion at 47 years old, before Roe v. Wade had even been decided. Almost nobody could have guessed that the woman at the center of that firestorm was someone Hollywood had once written off completely. Too tall, voice too deep, didn't look the part. Those were the reasons the industry gave for why Bea Arthur would never make it as a leading actress. Before she ever rewrote the rules of American television, she'd been a military servicewoman, a medical technician, and a stage actress grinding away in obscurity for nearly 3 decades.
It's very difficult because it's an unscripted show.
Right.
You know, so when I say I hate it, I mean it's difficult really feeling comfortable.
Here's the twist nobody saw coming. Every single quality they dismissed her for became the thing nobody else could copy. But Maude was just one chapter. How does a woman the industry deemed wrong for Hollywood end up as the face behind 2 of the most defining TV characters in American history? And what exactly did she have to give up along the way to get there? Bea Arthur was born Bernice Frankel on the 13th of May, 1922 in Brooklyn, New York. Her family was Jewish, with roots in Poland and Austria. Her father was Philip Frankel, her mother Rebecca Pressner, and Bernice was the middle daughter, sandwiched between an older sister named Gertrude and a younger one named Marion. When she was still young, the family packed up and relocated to Cambridge, Maryland, where her parents opened a women's clothing store. Cambridge was a small town, and the Frankels were one of the only Jewish families there. There was no artistic scene, no theater culture, nothing that would signal what was coming. But even in that quiet little town, something was already stirring in Bernice. She fell hard for movies at an early age, mimicking Mae West's voice and borrowing June Allison's smile, quietly feeding a dream that the world around her gave her almost no reason to believe in. She believed in it anyway.
Well, I don't know which came first because it was the height of the feminist movement,
Right.
which thank God is finally over, you know. But, and they sort of looked at me as though I was, you know, Joan of Arc of the
Right.
whole women's movement.
By 12 years old, Bernice was already nearly as tall as she'd ever get, and she towered over every other kid in her class. School plays kept casting her in male roles, which wasn't what she wanted at all. What she actually dreamed of was being a little blonde girl who could sing and dance, just like the stars she watched on the Hollywood screen. Her height made her self-conscious, but her sharp sense of humor more than made up for it. Her classmates voted her the wittiest girl in school. Then, at 16, she was diagnosed with a blood clotting disorder, and her parents made a decision that would quietly reshape her entire path. They enrolled her at Linden Hall, a boarding school in Pennsylvania, where she'd finish out her last 2 high school years away from home. That time on her own built something in her. She was already drawn to the arts, but she kept that ambition to herself, convinced her parents would push her towards something more practical. After graduating, she spent a year at Blackstone College for Girls in Virginia, still caught between what she wanted and what felt safe. Then the war changed everything. In 1943, Bernice enlisted in the United States Marine Corps Women's Reserve, becoming one of the first women to serve in that organization. She started as a typist at headquarters in Washington, D.C., but that wasn't enough for her. She put in a voluntary transfer request to the Motor Transport School at Camp Lejeune. She trained, qualified, and ended up serving as a military truck driver and transportation dispatcher at Cherry Point, North Carolina. When she received her honorable discharge in 1945, she left with the rank of Staff Sergeant, a 20-something woman who'd spent the war driving military trucks across a Marine Corps base. After the military, she tried one more detour. She enrolled at the Franklin School of Science and Arts in Philadelphia, earned a certification as a medical laboratory technician, and completed a hospital internship. But the work didn't take hold. After only a short time in the profession, she knew it wasn't where she belonged. So she made the call that actually mattered. In 1947, Bernice Frankel moved to New York, enrolled at the dramatic workshop of the new school, and stepped onto a stage for real. She joined off-Broadway theater companies and became a regular presence at the Cherry Lane Theater, working her way through Shakespearean plays, Greek dramas, and modern European productions, building something from the ground up, one small role at a time. For over 10 years, Bea Arthur's name meant everything inside New York's theater world and almost nothing anywhere else. The gap between stage and screen was something she understood firsthand, and her own body made that gap harder to close. At 5 feet 10, with sharp, angular features and a voice that sat low and unmistakable, she simply didn't match what Hollywood wanted from its actresses in the 1950s. While her peers were landing romantic leads, Bea kept getting handed strong-willed characters or women written decades older than she actually was.
But it certainly changed television. I mean, prior to that, there was, women always had beautiful little earrings and pearls, and were very supportive of their husbands, who were always a little...
somewhat subservient.
Yes, not just that, but who wasn't terribly bright, and they would always bail the men out of, ridiculous situations, starting with what? Ozzie and Harriet? I don't know.
Yeah.
But along came Maude, and the whole thing sort of changed.
Yeah, because...
She once said that as a little girl, all she'd ever wanted was to be one of those small, blonde, glamorous things up on the silver screen. That never happened. What happened instead was something far more interesting. The very qualities that kept doors closed to her slowly became the things that set her apart from everyone else. Around the same time, she started picking up television work as the medium was expanding fast across the country. She appeared in live programs like Studio One, Kraft Television Theater, The 7 Lively Arts, and Caesar's Hour, building camera experience without ever stepping away from the stage. Then came 1954, and a role that genuinely changed her trajectory. Bea Arthur was cast as Lucy Brown in the English-language production of The Threepenny Opera, one of the defining jobs of her off-Broadway years. It also marked the first time she shared a production with Lotte Lenya, an actress she would speak about with deep admiration for the rest of her life. Years later, she placed Lenya alongside Lee Strasberg and Sid Caesar as the three people who shaped her most as a performer. That's a short list. Getting onto it meant something. She kept working through the second half of the 1950s, moving between Broadway and off-Broadway without pause. One night, performing the song Garbage in Shoestring Revue, she caught the eye of a man named Norman Lear. He wasn't famous yet, neither was she. But that moment would matter more than either of them could have known at the time. A nightclub owner also pulled her aside during that same stretch and told her she should be doing comedy, not just drama. She kept going, kept moving between the stage and television, a way of knowing that those two chance encounters were quietly arranging the rest of her life. By 1964, after nearly 20 years of grinding through supporting work and small screen appearances, critics finally started paying attention. She joined the Broadway production of Fiddler on the Roof, cast as the matchmaker Yente. Her deep voice and knife-sharp comic delivery made an immediate impression. It was a supporting role, nothing more on paper. But the performance landed in a way that supporting roles rarely do, and for the first time, Broadway took Bea Arthur seriously as a force of her own. Those quiet years grinding through New York theater were finally starting to mean something. But just as her career was picking up real speed, her home life was under serious pressure. Her husband, director Gene Saks, was diagnosed with hepatitis and had to stop working entirely for a stretch. That meant Bea Arthur became the one keeping the household afloat. She kept performing, kept taking roles, and carried the financial weight for both Gene and their 2 adopted sons. It wasn't glamorous, but she did it without stepping back from her work for a single moment. Then 1966 arrived, and Gene Saks landed the job of directing the Broadway musical Mame. Bea Arthur wanted that leading role badly, but the producers handed it to Angela Lansbury instead. Here's where it gets interesting. Rather than walking away, she took the role of Vera Charles, the sharp, quick-witted best friend of the title character. That choice changed everything. Her performance in that role won her the 1,966 Tony Award for Best Featured Actress in a Musical. Angela Lansbury took home Best Actress that same night, and the two women bonded through that production into a friendship that held for the rest of their lives. That Tony Award did something beyond just recognizing Bea Arthur's talent. It put her name in front of people who had never set foot in a Broadway theater. Television producers noticed. Film producers noticed. Here was an actress that didn't fit any standard mold, a voice nobody could ignore, and a sense of comedic timing that felt almost impossible to teach. She kept the stage as her base through the late 1960s, but she was quietly building towards something bigger. In 1970, she landed a role in the film Lovers and Other Strangers. It wasn't a lead, but after years of being known almost entirely within theater circles, it was a real foothold on the big screen. Nearly 20 years of building, role by role, show by show, Broadway had cracked the door open for her. But what was coming next would blow it completely off the hinges. By the early 1970s, Bea Arthur was still not a recognizable face to most American television audiences. Then producer Norman Lear came calling with an offer to join All in the Family. She turned it down. Then she turned it down again. And again. She didn't think she was cut out for a long-running TV series, and she wasn't ready to leave the stage behind. It took repeated convincing just to get her on screen. Bea Arthur finally agreed to appear in 2 episodes of All in the Family as Maude Findlay, a character whose politics couldn't have been further from Archie Bunker's. The audience went absolutely wild. CBS was so caught off guard by the response that they fast-tracked the character into her own series within months. Maude premiered in 1972, and it ran for 6 seasons across 141 episodes. Nothing quite like it had existed on American television before. A middle-aged woman at the center of a prime-time comedy, one who was outspoken, politically charged, and completely unwilling to soften her edges, that was uncharted territory. The network simply didn't do that. She wasn't warm and reassuring like the women viewers were used to seeing. Maude was blunt, hot-tempered, and occasionally extreme, and that's exactly what made her so electric. People either loved her or couldn't stand her, and either way, they couldn't stop watching. That tension was the engine that drove the whole show. The series went places other sitcoms refused to go. Vietnam, Nixon, divorce, menopause, alcoholism, mental illness, domestic violence, gay rights. These weren't topics Americans expected to encounter between laugh tracks on a weeknight. The show's most explosive moment came in November 1972 with a 2-part episode called Maude's Dilemma. Maude finds out she's pregnant at 47. After a long, painful internal struggle, she decides to have an abortion. The episode hit the air 2 months before Roe v. Wade was handed down by the Supreme Court, meaning abortion was still illegal in most of the country when this storyline ran. The fallout was immediate. Dozens of local stations refused to broadcast the episode outright. Sponsors started pulling back. CBS was buried under thousands of letters of protest. Newspapers across the country turned the whole thing into a national argument over where entertainment ends and social commentary begins. And yet, about 65 million people watched those 2 episodes across the original broadcast and the reruns that followed.
He went on to adopt 2 black children and
That's right.
lead a very good life.
That's right. Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm a
They
child
all
of-
got in trouble, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
I talk
Yeah, that's
about
true. Yeah, they-
dysfunctional children.
sort of a
And
dysfunctional family.
The one Caucasian killed herself.
By the following summer, many of the stations that initially refused to air it had quietly reversed course once the public pressure cooled down. The story had already done its work. Maude's Dilemma is now widely considered one of the defining moments in American television history. The show's success turned Bea Arthur into one of the most recognizable actresses working on television, and the Emmy and Golden Globe nominations that followed confirmed what audiences had already decided for themselves. In 1977, Bea Arthur took home the Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Comedy Series, the first major television prize of her career. Critics have since placed Maude among the most influential sitcoms that decade produced. But even while the show was still running, she wasn't sitting still. Back in 1974, she stepped back into the role of Vera Charles for the film adaptation of Mom, reuniting with director Gene Saks. The movie landed with a thud, both at the box office and with reviewers. Still, appearances in the Star Wars Holiday Special and her own musical variety program made it clear her reach had grown well past the small screen. Then came a decision that genuinely shocked people. By 1978, Maude was still pulling strong ratings, and Bea Arthur walked in and asked them to end it anyway. She felt the character had said everything she had to say, and she had zero interest in dragging it out just because the money was good. That kind of conviction is rare, and it's exactly what made her who she was. Walking away from Maude didn't slow her down. She stayed one of the most familiar faces on American television, turning up in CBS specials, award shows, musical programs, and variety broadcasts throughout this stretch. Finding a role that hit as hard as Maude, though, wasn't easy. Her 1,978 appearance in the Star Wars Holiday Special got people talking, and for good reason. She played Akmena, a cantina keeper inside the Mos Eisley bar, and she performed an entire song on screen. Then, in early 1980, CBS built the Bea Arthur Special around her, a musical comedy showcase featuring Rock Hudson, Melba Moore, and a roster of well-known guest stars. In 1983, she tried her hand at a new sitcom. Amanda's was the American version of the beloved British comedy Fawlty Towers, and she played Amanda Cartwright, a sharp-tongued, quick-tempered owner of a small hotel. Expectations were genuinely high going in. They didn't hold. NBC pulled the plug before all 13 completed episodes even made it to air, airing only 10 of them. It was the first time since Maude that one of her television projects had collapsed that quickly. The early 1980s quietly became one of the few slow stretches in a career that had otherwise rarely paused. What was waiting on the other side of that quiet period, though, would change everything. The role the whole world would come to know her for, Dorothy Zbornak on The Golden Girls, was just around the corner. Bea Arthur kept working through the years, Broadway, television, guest spots, all of it. But nothing she touched after Maude Findlay came close to that same impact. Over 30 years into her career, the same quiet fear crept back in. Had she already peaked? Then 1985 happened. Screenwriter Susan Harris sat down to create a new character and built her almost entirely around Bea Arthur herself. The height, the voice, that razor wit. When Bea read the script for Dorothy Zbornak, a divorced schoolteacher sharing a Miami home with her mother and 2 friends, she said yes almost immediately. What followed was something nobody in television was ready for. Bea Arthur, Betty White, Rue McClanahan, and Estelle Getty stepped in front of the cameras together, and the audience never looked away. The Golden Girls became one of the highest-rated shows on American television, ranking in the top 10 for 6 of its 7 seasons and producing 180 episodes across the entire run. But the ratings were almost beside the point. The show quietly rewrote what television thought older women were allowed to be. No background roles, no gentle grandmothers clapping from the sidelines. 4 middle-aged women owned the story, with their friendships, their romances, their careers, and their very real struggles placed front and center. That had simply never been done before. More than 4 decades later, The Golden Girls still airs in reruns, and the conversation around it hasn't slowed down. Dorothy and Maude were both formidable women, but Bea Arthur was too smart to repeat herself. Where Maude fought with full volume, Dorothy won with silence, a pause, a stare, one perfectly placed sentence that landed harder than any shouting match ever could. That stillness became her signature, an almost expressionless face, a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep and unhurried, and comic timing so precise it looked effortless. Dorothy Zbornak became one of the most beloved comedic characters in the history of American television, and it was built entirely on restraint. The industry noticed. Emmy nominations, Golden Globe nominations, the recognition kept coming. In 1988, she took home her second Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Comedy Series, this time for Dorothy. By the time the show ended, every single one of the 4 lead actresses had won an Emmy, making The Golden Girls one of the only sitcoms in history where the entire main cast reached television's highest honor. Off-camera, the dynamic was just as interesting. Bea Arthur and Rue McClanahan already had history, having worked together back on Maude. When they reunited on set in Miami, that familiarity came right back, easy and immediate, like no time had passed at all. Her friendship with Angela Lansbury, first sparked during Mame, held strong for decades. Bea also had deep respect for Estelle Getty, which is remarkable when you consider the backstory. Getty played her mother on screen, yet she was nearly a year younger than Bea in real life, spending hours in the makeup chair before every single shoot just to sell the illusion. The relationship that drew the most attention from the press, though, was the one between Bea and Betty White. They were genuinely different people with different ways of working. They were never as close as Bea and Rue McClanahan were, but through all 7 seasons, they stayed professional every time the cameras rolled. By 1992, The Golden Girls was still pulling in strong ratings, and that's exactly when Bea decided to walk away. She felt the show had reached its natural stopping point and refused to let it drag on purely because it kept making money. After she left, the remaining 3 women moved forward with a sequel called The Golden Palace. Bea came back for the premiere as a guest, and the spin-off lasted just 1 season before it was over. After that, she dialed back considerably, but never disappeared entirely. In 1994, she made her Metropolitan Opera debut as the Duchess of Krakenthorpe in La Fille du Régiment, which was a genuinely unexpected turn for audiences who knew her primarily from television. She returned to the stage again the following year in Bermuda Avenue Triangle. On the small screen, she popped up in Malcolm in the Middle, voiced Femputer in Futurama, and played Larry David's mother in Curb Your Enthusiasm. But her most surprising appearance of that period came in 2005 at the Comedy Central roast of Pamela Anderson, where she delivered a string of wickedly risque passages in that signature deadpan delivery, and it became one of the most talked-about moments of the entire event. Alongside those roles, she was also building out a serious career as a one-woman stage performer. She toured the country with An Evening with Bea Arthur, then There's Bea, then Bea Arthur on Broadway, just between. Each show wove her stories, songs, and personal reflections in a way only she could pull off. She didn't keep those productions inside the US either. She took them to the United Kingdom, Australia, and South Africa, still commanding a stage well into her 80s. The woman simply refused to stop. The honors came in those final years of her career. In 2008, she was inducted into the Television Hall of Fame, one of the most prestigious recognitions the American television industry can offer.
About it, because I don't watch that much. I watch all the news shows, and I love Comedy Central. I don't know if you get it here.
Yes, we do. Comedy Central.
You know, do you get The Daily Show with Jon Stewart?
Yes, we do. The Daily Show with Jon Stewart.
Yeah. I know, it's my favorite show.
Mm-hmm.
That same year, the Golden Girls took home the Pop Culture Award at the TV Land Awards, and Bea stood alongside Betty White and Rue McClanahan for one of her last public appearances. Every cast reunion brought the house down, and for good reason. It marked more than 50 years of work by a woman who had reshaped American television not once, but twice. Bea Arthur kept her private life close, and she meant it. You rarely saw her name tied to romance columns or tabloid whispers. She almost never walked into interviews and started talking about marriage or personal relationships. What audiences got was the work, and the work was everything. The women she played were bold, sharp, unafraid of anything. But behind that image, Bea Arthur was quietly living a life most people never saw. Friends who knew her well remembered that she'd skip the Hollywood parties without a second thought and just go home. So what do we actually know about her personal life? Mostly the big milestones, a handful of rare comments she made herself, and the memories of people who were genuinely close to her. That's it. Her first marriage happened while she was serving in the United States Marine Corps. In 1944, she married Robert Allen Arthur, a serviceman who later built a career as a television writer, director, and producer. The marriage ran about 3 years before they went their separate ways, quietly, with no children and no public fallout. Here's the detail that most people overlook. When the marriage ended, Bernice Frankel kept his last name, just adjusting the spelling slightly from Arthur to Arthur. What started as a leftover from a short-lived union ended up becoming one of the most recognized names in television history. That name went up on Broadway marquees, primetime credits, and the hearts of millions of viewers. After the divorce, she headed back to New York with her sights set on acting. At the dramatic workshop of the new school, she crossed paths with a young actor named Gene Saks, who was grinding through the same struggle she was. Auditions, small roles, slow progress. They were both fighting for footing on the same stage. That shared fight pulled them together. By 1950, Bea Arthur and Gene Saks were married, starting something that would last nearly 30 years. They weren't just a couple, they were creative partners navigating the same industry side by side. They adopted 2 boys, Matthew and Daniel. Matthew eventually went into acting, while Daniel found his place in stage design. Even as Bea Arthur's career kept climbing and her schedule got harder to manage, she drew a firm line between her professional life and her family's. She rarely brought her kids into interviews. She almost never let cameras into that part of her world. People who visited her home said the same thing over and over. The moment that front door closed, the television star disappeared. What was left was a woman who cooked, read, looked after her pets, and enjoyed quiet evenings with the people she loved most. Gene gradually shifted toward directing and built a reputation as one of Broadway's most respected names, while Bea kept performing and collecting her own accolades. They talked through roles together, tracked each other's work, and watched their careers grow in real time. Then in 1966, Gene directed Mame, and Bea joined the cast as Vera Charles. She took home a Tony Award for it. That win wasn't just a career milestone, it was one of the brightest stretches in both of their lives, each of them reaching the top of the field they'd given everything to. But the late 1960s brought a shift neither could fully control, especially once Maude turned Bea into a television presence for tens of millions of Americans every single week. Gene stayed rooted in theater and film, making far fewer public appearances. Bea was now a household face. The gap between their worlds kept widening. There's no record of scandals or bitter blow-ups between them, but nearly 30 years of diverging lifestyles and the weight of her growing fame slowly pulled them in different directions. In 1978, they divorced. No hostile interviews, no tabloid headlines, no courtroom fights over property. After nearly 3 decades together, they chose a quiet exit and kept treating each other with dignity, which says something. Gene continued directing. Bea stepped into a new chapter, one that would eventually lead her to the Golden Girls and her second defining success. She never remarried. Her time after the split went to her work, her 2 sons, and later her grandchildren. Angela Lansbury, Adrienne Barbeau, and close friends all said the same thing. Bea preferred a quiet evening at home over any Hollywood party. When she wasn't on set, she was cooking, reading, walking her dogs, or sitting with family. That's a picture most people wouldn't recognize, given the sharp-tongued, battle-ready women she played on screen for decades. Off-camera, she lived simply and privately. In countless interviews, Bea Arthur almost never talked about regrets. But in her final years, when someone asked what she would change if she could go back, she didn't bring up her Tony. She didn't bring up her Emmy. The first thing out of her mouth was about her kids. "I wish I had spent more time with my children." It was one of the only times she ever spoke about personal regret that openly. Decades of stages, film sets, and touring schedules had taught her something she couldn't unsay. There are moments in family life that don't wait, and no career achievement, no matter how impressive, can buy them back. That admission also cracked open a side of her the public rarely saw. The world knew Bea Arthur as the woman who never backed down. But underneath all of that strength and wit was someone who measured her life by the quieter things. Bea Arthur never once said she regretted her career. What she did say was that every success cost her something, and the thing it cost her most was time with her kids while they were still young. That awareness shaped everything she did once the cameras stopped rolling. She turned toward the people who had always been there, her sons, her grandchildren, the friends who'd known her long before she was famous. By the time the new century arrived, she was done chasing the spotlight. No more long-term contracts, no more grinding audition cycles, no more proving anything to anybody. After decades of relentless work on stage and in television, she simply chose to slow down on her own terms. That's a kind of courage Hollywood rarely talks about. She didn't disappear completely, though. She handpicked her appearances. Malcolm in the Middle, Futurama, Curb Your Enthusiasm, the Comedy Central roast of Pamela Anderson, and her own one-woman stage shows. Every single one of those was a deliberate choice, something she genuinely wanted to do. Nothing obligatory, nothing just for the paycheck. Away from the cameras, the real Bea Arthur surprised almost everyone who got close enough to see her. Friends described someone who had zero interest in Hollywood parties, someone who'd rather be home cooking than standing on a red carpet. Adrienne Barbeau remembered it clearly, that after a long day of work, all she wanted was to go home to her family, her dog, and her own kitchen. She tended her garden. She spent time with her grandchildren. She kept her world small and warm and intentional. For a woman whose name had lit up marquees for decades, that quietness wasn't a retreat. It was exactly what she had always wanted. But quiet didn't mean idle. Bea Arthur had been vocal about women's equality, Jewish community causes, and animal welfare for years. As she got older, though, one cause pulled at her harder than the rest. LGBTQ+ teenagers with nowhere to go, kids rejected by their own families, living on the streets. That reality shook something deep in her. In 2005, even as her health was beginning to decline, she took the stage and raised roughly $40,000 for the Ali Forney Center, an organization dedicated to homeless LGBTQ+ youth. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because she believed, in the plainest terms possible, that no child deserved to be thrown away by the people who were supposed to love them most.
Yeah. And I keep talking about my very favorite movie of all time. I know I'm digressing, but I have to say this. Okay. Which was with Eugene Levy and John Candy.
Right.
When they played the Schmengi Brothers.
Yes.
And the movie was called The Last Polka.
Yes.
Which is my very favorite.
When people asked why she was taking fewer and fewer roles in those final years, her answer was simple and completely unambiguous. She only wanted to do the things she actually enjoyed. After a lifetime of meeting everyone else's expectations, she'd finally earned the right to mean that. She didn't want to disappear from the screen entirely. If the right role found her, she'd take it. But she was done committing years of her life to a television series just because it was pulling good ratings. After decades of grinding through exhausting schedules, fame had quietly stopped being the thing she was chasing. What she wanted now was the freedom to choose. What almost nobody knew was that during this same period, Bea Arthur was privately fighting lung cancer. A longtime smoker, she kept her diagnosis completely to herself. Even colleagues who worked closely with her had no idea she was going through treatment. On the 25th of April 2009, she died at her home in Los Angeles from complications of the disease. She was 86 years old. The news hit the entertainment world hard, bringing a close to more than 6 decades of work by one of the most consequential figures television has ever produced. The tributes came fast. Angela Lansbury called her the closest friend she'd ever had, saying she felt both heartbroken and relieved that Bea no longer had to carry the weight of her illness. Adrienne Barbeau spoke about a woman who was generous to her bones, deeply professional, and willing to hand over a better line to another actor if it made the whole scene land stronger. That kind of selflessness isn't common in this industry. Betty White and Rue McClanahan both said her loss left a hole that simply couldn't be filled, not just in their personal lives, but in the hearts of the millions who grew up watching the Golden Girls together. Over in New York, Broadway theaters dimmed their marquee lights simultaneously for 1 full minute in her honor. A woman who had given nearly everything to the stage got exactly the send-off she deserved. But here's what's remarkable. Even after she was gone, Bea Arthur was still taking care of people. Her will included a $300,000 donation to the Ali Forney Center. an organization supporting homeless LGBTQ+ youth. In 2017, the center opened the Bea Arthur Residence, a real housing facility built in her name for young people who had nowhere else to go. Not a plaque, not an award sitting in a glass case, a home. A place where vulnerable kids could actually be safe. Nothing she did in front of a camera captured who she truly was more honestly than that quiet, deliberate act of generosity. She brought laughter to millions, yes, but the woman Bea Arthur became in her final years was focused on something else entirely. After everything Hollywood had put her through, she used what she had left to give the most forgotten people a shot at something better. And she did it without a single camera rolling. Bea Arthur didn't reshape American television by playing glamorous women or projecting some airbrushed ideal of femininity. Her influence ran deeper than that. Before Maude and the Golden Girls came along, the idea of a woman in her 40s or 50s sitting at the center of a primetime sitcom was almost unheard of. For most of television's early decades, women over a certain age got pushed to the edges of the story. They played the mother, the neighbor, the background. Bea Arthur changed that completely, first through Maude Findlay and then through Dorothy Zbornak, proving that older women could carry an entire series on their shoulders, with sharp personalities, voices you didn't forget, and stories compelling enough to pull tens of millions of viewers back every single week. Her influence didn't stop at character. Maude put subject matter on American television that most entertainment programs hadn't dared touch. Abortion, divorce, menopause, mental health, alcoholism, domestic violence, women's rights, gay rights. These weren't background details. They were the point. Episodes sparked real national arguments when they first aired. Decades later, those same episodes are treated as turning points in television history. The show's willingness to go there also cleared a path for later series to tackle social questions in language ordinary people could actually connect with. Then there's the craft itself, and this part deserves attention. Bea Arthur almost never leaned on exaggerated expressions or the broad physical gags that traditional comedy relied on. What she used instead was a near expressionless face, that unmistakable low voice, and timing so precise it almost seemed mechanical. Every single line landed exactly where she wanted it. That deadpan approach became her signature, and it's the thing that built both of the characters most identified with her career. Later, generations of comedians have said, repeatedly, that it's one of the hardest styles of comedy to actually pull off. Most people never manage it. Her path to that level of mastery was also nothing like the typical Hollywood story. She didn't arrive with the look the industry had decided was acceptable. It took nearly 30 years from her first off-Broadway stage to the moment she became a genuinely national television star. That's not a footnote. That's the whole argument for what actually builds a lasting career. The characters she left behind reshaped how female roles got written on American television for years after she was gone. An older woman who was independent, sharp, opinionated, and completely unashamed of it. That image gradually became something writers felt they were allowed to put on screen. Bea Arthur is a big reason why. Writers, producers, and actors who've talked about strong female characters in the decades since have found it nearly impossible not to name her. And in the final years of her life, she extended that influence into something more personal.
Toured a number of places with it prior to the Broadway thing. And pretty wonderful.
Quite a bit of pressure, too, though.
Yes.
A one-woman show.
Well, it's actually 1.5 because I have I have a pianist with me.
Oh, okay.
Billy
Who
Goldenberg.
apparently is
Fabulous.
just a torso. Oh, okay.
Fabulous.
Yeah. All right, 1.5.
And so it's a 1.5 person show.
She committed her energy and her last stage performances to raising funds for the Ali Forney Center, focused specifically on homeless LGBTQ+ youth. The work didn't stop when the cameras did. She didn't just leave behind a television legacy. In her will, Bea Arthur donated an additional $300,000 to an organization supporting homeless LGBTQ youth, and in 2017, the Bea Arthur Residence opened its doors in New York City. No ribbon-cutting ceremony could capture what that building really meant. It was proof that her values weren't something she performed, they were something she lived. More than 60 years in entertainment, and she left quietly. No years-long scandal, no public feuds dragging through the tabloids, no desperate attempt to repair her image before the curtain came down. Just a life, fully lived, on her own terms. What stands out when you look at the whole arc of her story is this. She spent nearly 3 decades working in near obscurity before America finally knew her name. And when success arrived, twice she walked away from hit television series at their absolute peak because she felt the story had said everything it needed to say. That kind of self-possession is almost unheard of in Hollywood. Her road wasn't easy. There were years waiting in the wings on Broadway, moments where she had to choose between her career and her family, and feelings she admitted, only near the very end of her life, that still sat heavy on her heart. She carried more than audiences ever knew, but she kept moving. She never chased the version of stardom Hollywood had mapped out for women like her, and she never reshaped herself to fit an industry that preferred a narrower mold. That stubbornness, that refusal, turned out to be the thing that made her impossible to forget. Maude still catches viewers off guard today, its boldness startling for a comedy series that aired half a century ago. Dorothy Zbornak still shows up on television screens around the world every single day. That deep voice, that almost unreadable expression, those lines landing exactly the way they always did. Time hasn't softened any of it. And somewhere in New York, the Bea Arthur residence keeps its doors open for young people with nowhere else to go. The artist, the woman, the person who never stopped caring, each piece of her survives somewhere. That's a rare thing. Most people who spend a lifetime in the spotlight leave behind a brand. She left behind something that actually helps people. There's a reason her name is still spoken with a particular kind of respect, not just warmth, but genuine weight. She never let age, appearance, or what the industry expected of her set the ceiling. Every time Dorothy smirks or Maude cuts through someone with that signature bluntness, it doesn't just feel like a great performance. It feels like Bea Arthur, still in the room, still refusing to be anything other than exactly herself. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who deserves to know it. And if you want more stories like this one, from the people who shaped Hollywood in ways the history books barely cover, subscribe and stay with us. See you in the next one.